see some from Asia, so good evening to you. Welcome to all of you across the many time zones that are gathered with us today. I'm Tom Garrett. I'm the Secretary General of the Community of Democracies, and I want to welcome you to this virtual event on media freedom and fact-based reporting as key to safeguarding against disinformation. This is the second session of a two-day dialogue on countering malign external attempts to undermine democracy. We were honored yesterday to launch this dialogue with remarks by the Foreign Minister of Romania, His Excellency Bogdan Orescu. The Foreign Minister spoke very eloquently to the need for multilateral efforts by democracies to respond to malign influence and actions in our democracies. I want to thank Romania for its leadership as presidency of the Community of Democracies, and I also want to thank the US State Department for its financial support to this series of discussions. Technology has transformed the way in which we both provide and access information. Social media platforms such as Twitter or Facebook have made news more accessible to us all. But despite the positives of social media, which has allowed us to easily receive news and information, we also have to consider the problem of it being used to disinform the public. Our discussion today is going to focus on the critical role that media freedom and fact-based reporting play in countering propaganda that undermines public trust. So we're going to be hearing from experts who can speak about the challenges and tools that our democracies can utilize to counter these false narratives, which are found in both traditional and social media. So to start today's discussion, let me turn to our expert speaker, Ms. Leah Bray, who is the Deputy Coordinator of the Global Engagement Center at the US Department of State. Ms. Bray currently serves, as I said, as the Deputy Coordinator for Operations. She first joined the center as the Director for China. During her professional career, Ms. Bray has worked a full range of diplomatic, economic, and security issues related to China and the Indo-Pacific. From 2015 to 2017, Ms. Bray served as the Director for China at the National Security Council under both the Obama and the Trump administrations. Prior to service in the White House, Ms. Bray was the Director for China, a China policy advisor on the staff of senior defense officials, including the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and the Chief of Naval Operations. She herself was commissioned as an officer in the US Navy in 1996. In addition to these jobs in Washington I've mentioned, she has also served as part of Carrier Air Wing 2 and with the United States Sixth Fleet staff. And she was with the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Detachment in Japan. Ms. Bray has received a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of the South in Sewanee and earned a Master of Arts in National Security Affairs from the Naval Postgraduate School in 2002. We're delighted that she's able to join us, and so I would say, Ms. Bray, would you please share your insights with us now?
Sure. Thank you, Secretary General Garrett, for that kind introduction. I also want to thank the Community of Democracies, including Romania and the Permanent Secretariat, for hosting this event today and inviting me to participate. Democracies depend on the free flow of information and open exchange of information and ideas, tolerance for diverse viewpoints, and engaged and informed citizens who can participate in the political making process and hold their governments accountable. Disinformation threatens these processes. It distorts information environments, increases polarization, and poisons public dialogue with falsehoods and distractions. This conference is an important forum to discuss the critical role that independent fact-based media play in countering disinformation and malign influence and safeguarding our democratic processes. So thank you again for having me here today. As was said, my name is Leah Bray. Today, on behalf of the US State Department's Global Engagement Center, or GEC. The GEC's mission is to lead and coordinate efforts of the US government to identify, recognize, expose, and counter state-sponsored and non-state-sponsored propaganda and disinformation that undermines the stability of the United States or our allies and partners. We spend most of our time focused on a few bad actors, namely Russia, China, Iran, and non-state actors like violent extremist organizations. Malign influence activities by these actors threaten to weaken both very well-established democracies and budding democracies and promote authoritarianism globally. In Russia's case, Moscow spreads disinformation to create or exacerbate divisions in Western societies and aims to undermine trust in democracy and our democratic institutions. Russia's disinformation operations are often paired with other hybrid threats to further this goal. China uses propaganda, disinformation, and several tools of coercive influence to try to legitimize and ensure control by the Chinese Communist Party, set the global agenda, and remake international institutions so they favor Beijing's narrow interests and marginalize criticisms of China. Iran uses its global network of state-run media outlets to spread propaganda and disinformation to further Iran's geopolitical interests and tries to persuade global audiences of its global worldview. Iran also uses its substantial presence in the regional media environment to curb the spread of factual information about its bad human rights record on the domestic front, as well as its regional proxy organizations, including Hezbollah. Terrorist and violent extremist organizations use disinformation to recruit new members and inspire lone attackers, to radicalize vulnerable audiences in at-risk communities, to disseminate ideologies that justify violence, and to undermine the legitimate authorities of nation states. The GEC has a mandate to counter disinformation, propaganda, and malign influence from all these actors around the world. It's a big mission, to say the least. The GEC can't succeed in this effort alone. Instead, we seek to be a mission center within an expanding network of global like-minded partners in government, in the private sector, civil society, and the media, all working together to expose, counter, and build societal resilience against these malign influences. We're eager to deepen and expand our relationships with government and non-governmental partners around the world, and gatherings like this are vital to making those connections. So because today's focus is on the role of fact-based media in this effort, I'd like to share some of the GEC experiences working with journalists, fact-checking organizations, think tanks, and independent media to safeguard democratic institutions and highlight some of the great work and impact that they've had. Earlier this year, we partnered with a fact-checking organization in Taiwan to build its capacity prior to elections in January of this year. With GEC support, the organization hired more fact checkers, improved its research methodology, and built new features for its webpage and app so it could deliver more high-quality journalism to the public. Not only did traffic surge to their fact-checking services during the election, but people on Taiwan also looked to our partner during the COVID-19 pandemic for trustworthy public health information. This fact-checking organization plays a critical role in safeguarding Taiwan's democracy, providing its citizens with truthful information when they need it most. The GEC also supports audience access to independent media outlets by helping expand their Russian language programming. In countries frequently targeted by Russian disinformation and attempts to undermine democracy, our support has helped provide fact-based and unbiased coverage of pre-election and post-election developments in these countries via radio and online programming. And we've worked with local partners to track and analyze Russian disinformation campaigns to educate the public and build resiliency against malign influence efforts by foreign countries. Because the Iran regime seeks to deny its citizens access to fact-based information and to mask the extent of its efforts to undermine the sovereignty of nearby countries, the GEC supports independent journalists who analyze and publish factual reporting on Iran's malign influence and its human rights violations around the world. Finally, the GEC published our own report recently titled Russia's Pillars of Disinformation and Propaganda. In it, we document the 5 main tools that Russia uses to spread disinformation around the world. They are official government communications, state-funded global messaging, cultivation of proxy sources, weaponization of social media, and cyber-enabled disinformation. These 5 pillars form an ecosystem that works together to create and launder disinformation narratives. The GEC believes that by exposing the efforts of foreign actors to export disinformation, propaganda, and malign influence, we can increase public awareness and build societal resilience to it. We believe that civil society and the private sector are essential partners in this effort. So although we have collectively had some success, there's still much more work to be done. State and non-state actors continue to exploit the openness of our societies and media to spread disinformation and propaganda. New technologies and platforms will continue to emerge, providing new opportunities for bad actors to spread disinformation. I'd like to challenge all of us gathered here today as like-minded members of democratic societies to think about ways we can further collaborate and multilateralize our efforts to increase our resilience to malign influence and protect our democratic institutions. Importantly, we must take care that our approaches to countering malign influence do not inadvertently undermine the bedrock principles of our democracies as enshrined in the Warsaw Declaration, including commitments to freedom of expression, including for members of the press, and independence of the media. Democracies must instead counter these challenges by embracing our strengths, commitments to transparency, truthfulness, freedom of speech, and public debate. So thank you again for inviting me here today and contributing to this important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to say thank you especially for this valuable addition to our two-day discussion. And now let me turn to our keynote speaker, Mr. Jamie Fly. Mr. Fly is a senior fellow and senior advisor to the president of the German Marshall Fund, and he works out of the Berlin office of the German Marshall Fund, where he researches and speaks about transatlantic relations, US foreign policy, great power competition with Russia and China, as well as democracy and human rights. Mr. Fly is known to many of us here in his most recent job as President and Chief Executive Officer of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague. Prior to his time at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, he served as Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Alliance for Security Democracy, and he was also Director of the Future of Geopolitics and Asia Programs at the German Marshall Fund. Other aspects of experience include serving as Counselor for Foreign and National Security Affairs to Senator Marco Rubio, as the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative, and Mr. Fly also was a member of the Bush administration at the National Security Council and also in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We appreciate you being here, Mr. Fly, and please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to the Community of Democracies for organizing this discussion along with the Romanian MFA. I think it's impressive that the community is touching on issues like this, where these are common challenges that democracies face, and also challenges that are being exploited by authoritarian actors who fundamentally are opposed to democracy. As Ms. Bray noted just now, disinformation continues to be a tool of choice for authoritarians who are trying to undermine democracy. We've seen a proliferation of these tactics over the last 4 years, certainly inside the US, but also globally. And we've seen some disturbing trends as these tactics have proliferated. We've seen a privatization of disinformation beyond just state actors. There are domestic actors, including in some of our democracies, who are now using these tools to advance their political goals. Which ultimately, I think, also contribute to the corrosion of our democracy. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I saw over the last year when I was at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, especially related to the pandemic and its influence on independent media and the way that authoritarian actors are using the pandemic to pressure independent media. And then I'll also lay out some suggestions about how democracies can tackle this challenge together. The pandemic created a situation where disinformation can not just be corrosive to democracy, but obviously can also be deadly. We've seen rampant disinformation about the facts related to COVID-19. This has probably led to the deaths of additional people who were not correctly informed about the virus itself, about basic health practices to prevent the virus from spreading. We've also seen many authoritarian leaders deny the existence of the virus or dispute its arrival in their countries. This was something that was a common theme across the 27 language services that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty operates across Eurasia. Many governments just wanted to be in denial about the facts, about the need to respond quickly and effectively to the pandemic. So they tried to dismiss what was looming, either sometimes in neighboring countries or even as it crossed their borders, and to cover up the arrival of the pandemic. We've seen people who are very frustrated about their limited ability to hold their leaders accountable sometimes take to the streets in response. We've seen this now in multiple countries, most notably Belarus, where obviously Alexander Lukashenko spent months denying the existence of COVID before he eventually claimed to have gotten it and then survived it, but having done very little to actually insulate his public from it. And in a lesser known example, we're now seeing a political crisis in a place like Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, which is partly related to the government's failure to deal adequately with the pandemic. We've also seen authoritarian actors try to use the pandemic to their advantage. We've seen, as Ms. Bray noted, Russia, China, Iran step up their use of disinformation against democracies, sometimes to highlight their own supposed success stories. We obviously saw this earlier this year coming out of China, trying to amplify information about their supposed efforts to assist other countries. China was the most notable here, highlighting its so-called PPE diplomacy across much of Europe and other parts of the world, obviously exaggerating that assistance, sometimes masking important details about that assistance. Russia at times did the same. We also saw all of those actors try to pit democracies against each other, try to drive a wedge between the transatlantic democracies, and in some cases conduct disinformation campaigns aimed at distancing even EU member states from one another, especially at moments when some of the EU member states were suffering significantly from coronavirus, especially when it hit hard in Italy and Spain, trying to present a vision of the EU, every man for himself, countries not willing to help their neighbors. That was a common theme that we saw Russia in particular use, but also China to a lesser extent, especially on social media. And we've finally seen all of these actors present a distorted vision of the origins of the pandemic, in some cases trying to blame the United States and promote conspiracy theories about the origins of the pandemic. Internally, when I was at RFERL, we saw many of these authoritarian actors use the pandemic as an excuse to crack down on independent media, institute new accreditation requirements for journalists, which were much more restrictive than previous practices. As some countries went into emergency lockdown, there were often attempts to limit the ability of journalists to move around the country to adequately cover what was going on, which obviously was very helpful to governments that did not want journalists showing up at hospitals to actually report on how many sick patients were there or what the true state of the government's healthcare system was. These were common tactics that we saw from many authoritarian actors. Why is this all harmful? Why does ultimately independent media do anything to respond to these challenges? Well, I think independent media outlets are important because in the 21st century, more than ever, the information domain is where powers are attempting to shape their narratives. It's where authoritarians, given that they lack basic legitimacy amongst their publics, are trying to control information flows in a fight to retain their power. And the information domain is also where individual citizens are going to try to organize and ultimately overthrow illegitimate rule. The information domain is also an area that if an authoritarian actor is trying to undermine democracy, it's a useful domain for them to try to sow chaos, to exploit divisions that may already exist in our democratic societies, and to really put democracies off balance. So fact-based, objective sources of news are incredibly powerful in any attempt to counter authoritarian efforts to undermine democracy. These outlets help expose corruption, government malfeasance, and ultimately they provide a common set of facts that citizens can unite around when they're making political decisions. Yet, even though these outlets are even more important than ever, I'd argue, even before the pandemic, they were under pressure across much of the world, including in the most advanced Western democracies. A lot of that is due to economic trends and the pressures due to digitalization as advertising revenue of traditional media has disappeared and as people have moved online to get their news and information. We've seen some of the impact of that, including in many democracies where business interests have now taken over certain media platforms, sometimes with a malign political agenda tied to the current government, and the rise of what I call oligarchic media. And I saw this in many markets where Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty operates, where people do have choice, but it's usually biased outlets that are promoting one or the other political message. And oligarchic media is very susceptible to authoritarian interference from the outside as well, given the corruption nexus that ultimately funds oligarchic media. We've also seen governments trying to criminalize free speech and journalism. Again, this was already happening in places like Russia prior to the pandemic. We've seen a new impetus towards that across much of Eurasia, and unfortunately in some democracies who have used public health as a reason to maybe put up some guardrails about what the media can report on. And we've seen significant demonization of journalists, which can lead to sometimes threats of violence and ultimately efforts to push journalists out of democratic societies. So what should democracies do in response? First, I believe that we need to push back against authoritarian restrictions on media. When we see them, we need to call them out. Democracy should not be bystanders and allow authoritarians to close the media space in their own countries. We see some of the negative impact of this in places like China, where reportedly there were journalists who early on tried, both within Wuhan and those outside of Wuhan, to travel there to report on the pandemic, and were silenced by the Chinese state. In some cases, some of these journalists were jailed and paid the ultimate price for their efforts at independent reporting. We should, as democracies, prioritize this issue in bilateral engagement with governments, and when necessary, take punitive measures, including sanctions, to back up that engagement. Second, we need to develop our own tools. Within our own democracies, we need to strengthen our domestic public broadcasters, ensure that they remain nonpartisan and independent of whatever government may be in power. For those democracies that fund international broadcasters, I'd argue that we need to increase our cooperation between our international broadcasters, and also discuss at a government-to-government level how we are engaging the social media platforms and engaging them on issues related to regulation and their responsibilities in ensuring that their platforms do not become susceptible for the promulgation of conspiracy theories and disinformation. And we need more coordination from country to country about those rules and regulations that are imposed on the tech companies. Third, I think we should demand reciprocity with the adversary-funded media from countries like China and Russia. Many of them now have international broadcasters that are operating in our own societies. At times, those broadcasters serve to promote disinformation in our own democracies. While at the same time, they're trying to push our broadcasters out of their own countries. And so I think we need to set some terms with those authoritarian actors that if they want access to our publics, that we need to have greater access for our broadcasters to their publics. Finally, I think we need to make sure that we're also looking inward, not just at places like China and Russia, but that we're sharing best practices and willing to talk to each other in democracies about what's going on inside our own societies, what has worked, what has not when it comes to countering disinformation. We maybe need some more cross-border media partnerships to help shore up the state of independent media in some of the democracies where it's most threatened. And we also need more engagement amongst democracies about how to educate our citizens on media literacy. And an educated public is one of the best ways to counter disinformation. So there could be more dialogue about that. Finally, I just end by saying, I mean, I believe the stakes are high for the future of democracy when it comes to independent media. The deterioration in the media space and the rampant spread of disinformation has come at a time when many of our democracies were already under pressure. The health and viability of our democracies are fundamentally at risk when independent media is threatened, which is why the authoritarians are focusing so much attention on this area of our democratic debate. And even in places like the United States or in Germany, where I'm based right now, the growing distrust of media and the demonization of media allows conspiracy theories to flourish. It sometimes leads to violence, physical protests. We've seen this with some of the transatlantic spread of things like the QAnon conspiracy theory, and that can lead in very dangerous directions. We can't just focus on ourselves, however. I do believe that independent media is also essential to the advance of freedom. You can currently see that in places like Belarus, where the Lukashenko regime has gone to great lengths to try to control the media space, conducting internet blackouts, and where the Kremlin has even gone so far as to fly in Russian state TV technicians and journalists to man Belarusian propaganda outlets that have been weakened by walkouts and staff protests. And we as democracies need to take these issues more seriously and look to see what we can do to help actors like the Belarusian opposition and others who are seeking freedom to maintain their ability to communicate with the broader public, even as the regime is cracking down with the assistance of countries like Russia. As I said, this is not just about defending ourselves, but we need to be committed to the spread of democracy, and ensuring access to independent and objective information is central to that. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for your remarks, and thank you for your very practical advice and counsel to us. This is a very great beginning, I think, for the panel, which is to follow. And our panel discussion today is going to be moderated by Mr. Dan Carbonaro, who is director of Calle Europea, which means European Way. Mr. Carbonaro has dedicated his professional life for more than 20 years to media activity in national news agencies, television, and newspapers. He founded European Way in 2006, and today it's the largest EU and transatlantic affairs media entity in Romania. More than 100,000 European citizens are connected to this source of information. In the last few years, he has done a number of things, such as moderating the citizens' dialogues organized in Romania with the presidents of the European Commission, the European Parliament, European Committee of the Regions, and with various EU commissioners or EU officials. During the first Romanian presidency of the Council of Europe, he moderated a series of public events organized in Bucharest and Sibiu. Dan's bio states that he's dedicated to developing, supporting, and building networks of citizens who believe in the European Union and in the transatlantic values. And so, Dan, with that, may I turn the floor to you?
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for introducing me. And I hope that for the next almost 1 hour, we will have a fruitful debate in this panel dedicated to the best practices that the governments can utilize to counter false narratives promulgated by governments and both traditional and social media. We have 3 distinguished panelists together with us. I will just mention at the beginning their name and their positions, and then I will offer the opportunity to engage the dialogue. we have here today with us Veronika Kratka-Spalkova, analyst of the Kremlin Watch program of the European Value Center of Security Policy in Prague. Sarah Cook, senior research analyst for China, Hong Kong and Taiwan, Freedom House. And David Schulman, senior advisor for countering foreign authoritarian influence, International Republican Institute. So as you could see, we have almost a perfect gender balanced panel, including me, of course. We have two distinguished ladies and gentlemen as panelists. And with your permission, I will start by presenting shortly Mrs. Sarah Cook. She's a senior research analyst for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at the Freedom House, as I mentioned. And she directs the China Media Bulletin, a monthly digest in English and Chinese, providing news and analysis on media freedom developments related to China. Cook is also the author of the several Asian country reports for Freedom House annual publications, as well as 3 special reports about China, the Battle of China Spirit, the Politburo's predicament, and the long shadow of Chinese censorship. Her comments and writings have appeared on CNN, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, and the US Congressional Executive Commission on China. Before joining Freedom House, Mrs. Cook co-edited the English translation of China More Just, a memoir by prominent rights attorney Gao Zisheng, and was twice a delegate to United Nations Human Rights Commission meeting in Geneva for an NGO working on religious freedom in China. She received a BA in International Relations from Pomona College, and as a Marshall Scholar, completed master's degree in politics and international law at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And the first challenge, the first question that I would like to address to Mrs. Sarah Cook, it's, and I will offer, as we settled 5 minutes for the answer, as in the July 2020 China Media Bulletin of Freedom House, you speak of Hong Kong's new national security law, threatening freedom of expression and opinion. What actions could prompt changes to address the erosion of this freedom, which undermines actually the access of the real situation in Hong Kong? Mrs. Cook, please unmute your mic.
Oh, there, I think I did.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Okay, now, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think before turning briefly to the situation in Hong Kong, I think one of the things that's so important in understanding what happens in Hong Kong relative to the broader topic we're discussing about disinformation and Chinese influence is how much Hong Kong and Taiwan are really canaries in the coal mine. Because if we look at the broader evolution of the way in which the Chinese Communist Party has sought to influence media outside of China, it really, so Hong Kong is such an important aspect of it. And so many of the tactics that we're seeing now affecting mainstream media around the world in dozens and dozens of languages for hundreds of millions of news consumers really started with targeting of the Chinese diaspora media and Chinese language media in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I think, and that includes things like co-opting owners and purchasing stakes in media to try to influence and create self-censorship. Even more recently, when we look at the emergence of China and China-linked actors in the disinformation space on global social media. Unlike Russia, and back in, when Russia, this came up with regards to Russia in the 2016 elections, I was on panels, I was like, yeah, China doesn't do that. But now they do. And really, when we look at the data, we first kind of became aware of this in 2019 as this tactic was used, especially in Chinese language, especially regarding Hong Kong, and especially both targeting and vilifying Hong Kongers, but also a lot of it was in traditional Chinese characters read in Taiwan and Hong Kong. And now we're seeing that evolving to other areas and spaces and other languages. So I think that that's just one, when we're looking at both what's happened in Hong Kong under the national security law and the general connection and importance of Hong Kong to understanding the way in which the CCP operates, it really is quite significant. In terms of the national security law, I think everyone knows it was such an abrupt and really arguably illegal move by Beijing. And what's happened over the past month, especially in the media space, is actually what many people had feared. And in the latest issue of the China Media Bulletin, we looked at 4 ways in which media space in Hong Kong has really declined. One has been this attack on Apple Daily, one of the few independently, really very strongly independent print media outlets in Hong Kong, and owned by Jimmy Lai, who's a kind of a vocal pro-democracy supporter. Raids, arrests of Jimmy Lai. We've seen a new effort. This relates to Mr. Fly's comments in terms of a new form of efforts for police to accredit media, which you never really saw before in Hong Kong. It was done through independent journalist unions, and restrictions and rejections of visas for foreign journalists. And of course, the creeping kind of self-censorship, both by media and by independent columnists, cartoonists, because under the national security law, they could really go to prison for a very long time. And so all of this has very much created a situation where the media environment in Hong Kong is more closely resembling what's happened in China. But Hong Kongers are very resilient. And so I think the thing I would say a few things about what happens in Hong Kong, and also to an extent in Taiwan, to really push back, and I think is useful to consider. One is, even before the national security law, as self-censorship had really started to creep in significantly in both Hong Kong and Taiwan, at least over certain media outlets, because the owners were co-opted by Beijing, you saw this rise of digital media. And digital media outlets often created and launched by veteran journalists who got concerned over what was happening at their own news outlets in terms of pressure and restrictions. And it's really incredible to see how popular these outlets are. And there are a lot of them. There's New Talk in Taiwan, there's Store Media, there's in English, Hong Kong Free Press in Hong Kong, there's Initium in Hong Kong. And they've received quite a lot of public support. In fact, in terms of the financial model, a lot of it's been done through crowdfunding, to be honest, and just contributions from readers for the most part. Some of them have a paywall, but many of them don't. And we can see in terms of even just the articles of mine that we translate on these issues and get published in these outlets, how much interest there is. And so I think, to speak to, the comments that Ms. Bray made about the demand in some of these societies for trustworthy information, it can actually serve to counter both the financial strangling of independent media, but also pushing the media agenda. Because what starts to happen is that there's self-censorship over certain media, or among certain media, on topics related to Beijing. But the digital media are reporting on it, and they're doing investigations. And once they talk about it, then it's out in the public domain, and it's putting pressure, because there's still some market competition over those more tightly controlled media, to also report on it. And so I think overall, you did see a kind of a real decline, in the space on certain topics, and then an uptick once these media were launched, in terms of even some of the more tightly influenced media just having to address these issues. I think as we see more and more examples of Chinese entrepreneurs with links to China, there's now a fellow a Macau businessman who's bought a Portuguese media group, and they're expanding to Brazil, to Mozambique, and he's now sitting on the National People's Congress. And that's exactly what happened in Hong Kong. So I think as these things emerge in other countries, this element of trying to see how to support independent digital media, whether it's in terms of capacity or financial or training support, it could be one way of pushing back against the inevitable self-censorship that emerges in that space. I think I can stop there. I think regards to the situation in Hong Kong right now and what outsiders can do, I think first just monitoring and seeing how we can support people, making sure democracies do not have extradition treaties to Hong Kong, the way you might be careful about an extradition treaty with China, considering sanctions over Hong Kong and Beijing officials related to the passage of the national security law, and making sure there's immigration and refugee support for Hong Kongers wishing to flee Hong Kong. So I think those are some specific actions that could be taken to support those in Hong Kong seeking more freedom and facing the very difficult situation under national security law right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will kindly invite you, Sarah, to stay with us, because we will have another round of questions, including for you. And now we are going towards Dr. David O. Schulman, Senior Advisor at the International Republican Institute. He oversees IRI's work addressing the influence of China, so we remain on this area, and the other autopsies on democratic institutions and governance in countries around the world. He is also an adjunct senior fellow at the Center of New American Security. He previously served for nearly a dozen years as one of the US government's top experts on Asia, most recently as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for East Asia on the National Intelligence Council. Dr. Schulman has testified on China topics before subcommittees of both chambers of the US Congress, and he earned a PhD in political science of USLA, MALD from Fletcher School, and a BA in government from Georgetown. David, I hope you can hear us. Because the next question is towards you.
Okay.
How can the democratic community prevent and counter malign external influence of China and other autocracies on democratic institutions, while at the same time ensuring the right of press to collect, report, and disseminate information, news, and opinions? We just heard the opinion from Sarah Cook about the situation in Hong Kong, so we can not only imagine, we can see how the things are going. Please.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you to the organizers for putting on this important event on this really critical topic. I think that's an excellent question because it gets right to the heart of the role of the media in building democratic resilience to malign foreign influence. At IRI, we've compiled now a significant number of country case studies on the Chinese Communist Party's means of influence and effects on different types of democracies. And in each case of resilience, it's transparency, it's the very rights of the press that you mentioned in your question that are the core elements of an independent media that are really key to mitigating the risks of engagement with China and with other autocracies. So in places like in Australia, where China has undertaken significant interference efforts in the political process and in other domains, it was investigative journalism that exposed the Chinese Communist Party's efforts and set Canberra on a path to mount a more effective response to better protect its institutions. A different sort of example is in Kenya, where the investigative work by one of our partners, Edmund Okoth, on opaque investment deals and implementation of projects such as the standard gauge railway have contributed to greater attention to the need for more transparency and to the Chinese Communist Party's growing links and governance trainings for the ruling Jubilee Party. So when we talk about preventing and countering malign influence, media freedom really is critical. And I think encouragingly, this means that the democratic community does not need to reinvent the wheel for the most part when we talk about building resilience. In many regards, it comes down to the kind of work that implementers have been doing with partners for decades. It's more independent media, more transparency, and supporting the rights of the press from pressure from external actors, or even more frequently, I would argue, from local leaders and elites who have some measure of control in the media space. And I liked Jamie Fly's term for this, the oligarchic media. These are, actors who are self-interested in squashing negative coverage of China in many cases. And so thus, in many places, China is really just pushing on an open door in terms of its influence. So it's critical for media to play a role not just in exposing Chinese and Russian efforts, but holding their own local officials' feet to the fire. These actors typically are not corrupting the innocent in these countries, but they're taking advantage of limited transparency, of corruption, of governance gaps, and exploiting and exacerbating them. And we have many examples of this in the Maldives, in Malaysia, in Ecuador, many other places. So media and transparency are critical, but of course, China is aware of this. And this is why the Chinese Communist Party is increasingly going to great lengths in many countries to shape the local media landscape so that influence efforts by government-linked entities and also the party's gross human rights abuses at home go virtually unreported, and that China is seen in a positive light. And this is done in many different ways, and I won't go into it too deeply, but pouring billions of dollars into increasingly pervasive official propaganda in countries, content sharing agreements with media, with local media, often unlabeled as coming from official Chinese sources, investing in and acquiring cash-strapped local news outlets, which results in more positive coverage of China, often through self-censorship. And in Africa in particular, just one example, there's a company linked to the Chinese government that is now the dominant digital television company with 25 million subscribers across 30 different countries. And this is leading to real concerns about how coverage is being shaped and even tie-ups that this company has with state broadcasters in a place like Zambia. So that's really something that we need to pay a lot of attention to. And then there's also a massive effort at so-called journalist trainings in developing countries where actual journalistic training is minimal. And the focus is on the benefits of engaging China and welcoming its Belt and Road Initiative investments in particular. And participants are encouraged to write glowing stories in their local media. So through these sorts of efforts to shape local media coverage, as well as other means of shaping the information space, including in academia and research institutions, Beijing's really looking to manipulate discourse and effectively neutralize institutions which, in a more healthy democracy, would be exposing and mitigating the negative consequences of engaging with China. So it's critical for media professionals to not only have the freedom to report and investigate, but also to understand the Chinese Communist Party or another actor like the Kremlin, and the particular kind of methods that they use to shape the media itself and its coverage. And this understanding is actually quite rare, in part because of the Chinese Communist Party's efforts, but also more often simply because people have just not had cause to look into it. But it's really critical, and you can look at places where they've been successful in pushing back, like Australia, like the Czech Republic. And it's not a coincidence that you have people who have deep knowledge and understanding of the Chinese Communist Party, and they can help those around them, including the media, understand where to look and how to expose and counter what China is doing. It's also important to note, and Sarah touched a bit on this, that China is targeting Chinese diaspora media for influence in many countries around the world as part of a broader campaign to use its influence in those communities, including through compelling students and businesses to act as political agents. The government uses its control over many diaspora media organizations, including digital ones like WeChat, to push its narrative and to squelch voices in the Chinese community, that is, voices of citizens of another country, not China, that might not align with the party's views on any number of issues. And China's efforts of coercion and intimidation of Chinese Australians in particular, the Chinese diaspora media in Australia, are really instructive, and the democratic community really should be dedicating ourselves to supporting independent Chinese media in the diaspora so they can survive despite the efforts of the Chinese Communist Party, as well as sharing the lessons of those experiences with the sizable diaspora communities in other places like Panama and many other countries around the world. And that brings me lastly to the importance of sharing lessons learned across countries about China's influence efforts, and in particular the key role of the media in building resilience. And this is critical, particularly in many parts of the world that have not yet experienced the sort of negative influence that they have in places like Australia and like Taiwan, but that they can learn from and prepare based upon what those countries have faced and what they have done. Leah Bray mentioned the importance of work with partners in Taiwan. Sarah Cook talked about the canary in the coal mine there. Taiwan really offers the key example of a government and civil society effectively exposing and proactively countering PRC disinformation on a scale that just hasn't been experienced anywhere else yet, particularly in the digital domain. And so looking at Taiwan's efforts to protect the integrity of its information space are a model for other countries only beginning to experience what Taiwan has for a very long time, and especially since 2018. So I'll just close by saying, that there's a lot of challenges and problems that I just kind of went over, but there is a positive conclusion that I've drawn from my last couple of years working on this, which is that there really is a growing number of democratic activists and media professionals around the world who are not just more aware of what's happening at the hands of foreign authoritarian actors, but who are actually taking action to bolster resilience and protect their own countries from the risks that come from that sort of influence. And we need to really build on that progress. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
And analysis, and I hope that we are ready to start the dialogue with Mrs. Veronika Krapka-Szpalkova, analyst, Kremlin Watch program of the European Value Center for Security Policy in Prague. She holds a bachelor degree in political science and European studies and a master degree in international relations and European studies from Palacký University in Olomouc. Sorry for my bad Czech, Mrs. Szpalkova. And at the same university, she currently acts as a PhD student in the field of political science, and she focuses on the research of propaganda and disinformation. She joined the European Values Security Center 3 years ago, first as an intern and gradually worked her way up to the position of analyst she holds today. She works as an analyst in the specialized Kremlin Watch program, where she is primarily responsible for monitoring the Czech disinformation scene. Before trying to ask you the question, can you hear us, Veronica?
Yes, I can.
Great. This is
okay.
Good news. Okay, so once again, nice to see you. And the question for you is, what are strategies that democracies can utilize to counter false narratives promulgated by the Kremlin? And what is the role of media in addressing disinformation? Please try not to take more than 5 minutes for this answer. We are fighting against time again, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy that I can take part at this event. I will try to make it really short. It's a very direct question, and I had prepared a very direct and specific answer, but it would take more than 5 minutes. What I want to talk about is a very concrete strategy that we as a security center applied in the Czech Republic in the Kremlin-related agenda, and currently are applying in the China-related agenda, and it's working from the point of civil society, because the key player in this game in tackling hostile influence and tackling disinformation campaigns, the key player really is the civil society, and very concrete segments of the civil society. If you have a democracy that has a government that does not have any strategy or does not even acknowledge this as a threat, you need to start really like from the beginning, and at first to build a community of people who actually understand the threat itself. And as a first step, this should be your goal. Me and my colleagues from the Security Center, we identified 5 areas that are very specific and contain specific steps that people can take in order to help their countries to be more resilient and to counter the hostile influence and the disinformation coming from foreign countries. The first area is called mapping of the programming network. What you want to really do is scrutinize and watchdog the politicians and the institutions, and map the programming actors in general and expose them publicly in cooperation with journalists, which is the role that the media play here. Because if you are an activist or an NGO and you're saying your arguments, and even if your arguments are really strong and data-based, if you're the only voice saying it out loud in the information space, people find really hard to believe you. It's hard to build a trust among the society. So you need to have a relationship with investigative journalists who trust you, and you can share your information with them, and they can expose these programming actors publicly through other more popular channels than you as an activist or an NGO can do. Also, the second area is called challenge disinformation narratives. Debunking the disinformation is of course important. We need to do that. People need to know what the truth is, but usually debunking of a disinformation is just not enough. It's too little and too late, and we need to work on how to stop the disinformation before it goes viral. And this can be done by creating challenging narratives, more sort of attractive, sexy challenges that people will have next to the disinformation narratives, and they will actually have a choice. Because sometimes with the disinformation narratives, they just go so strong and so viral that it's impossible to get them out of the information space. The third area is called investigative journalism. I already talked about it. It's connected with the first area. It's really crucial to have journalists who understand the thread, who understand the field, and who trust you and are willing to cooperate with you on this. But one of the important steps is also that the media outlets and journalistic associations in our countries should develop training programs for journalists, because the information space and the media space has changed significantly, and we still have a lot of journalists who don't really know how the social media and online media work. So we really need to educate them in this area. Then we have the fourth area that's called coordination and networking, because if you're building a network, you need to coordinate it somehow. The network should consist of, as I said, NGOs and journalists. But after that, you should also add to your network government insiders, MPs, and their staffers. And you should build an expert community of people on different levels in the society who are aware of the threat, who acknowledge the threat, and who are willing to tackle these threats with you and expose them and work with you. And the last area is called media literacy, of course. It's a crucial part for our societies to stay democratic. But media literacy is really an investment for the future. It's necessary to do it, but it doesn't concern only students and young people, but we need to educate in this field also the teachers, because it's a very actual right now in the Czech Republic, because the schools are closed and the teaching is online. And we still have a lot of cases of teachers who don't know how to use Zoom or Skype or any other communication platform. And this is really basic usage of technology. So we also need to educate the teachers and teach them how to teach about media and about technologies.
This network of truth that can contribute to counter the false narratives promulgated by authoritarian regimes, let's say. And now I'm having only, according to the official program, I only have 2 minutes to ask you a general question, and inside the 2 minutes to obtain also the answers. So I will take maybe less than 30 seconds for the question. And then we will try to take the answers from you, Sarah, after that, David, and of course Veronica. And as we promised, and I was told that we will have also a Q&A session open to our public. We will use the next minutes to take some questions. So the general question I will address to you, the panelists, is the following: how can we tackle the new dangers coming from a large increase in dissemination of disinformation by malign actors associated with current global pandemic? Sarah, will you?
Hi, well, that's a big question, but one thing I'll say, just I think it's a short answer, and this builds on both what David and Veronica were talking about, which is it's gotten to the point that China is such a big player in the media spaces in other countries that we need to have a real acknowledgement of that and really mainstream the response. So it can't just be siloed off where there's like China experts who kind of know a little bit about this, but maybe other parts of not just the government, but also civil society, including those working in the media sector or on press freedom advocacy or media regulation, don't really know about this problem so much. And so I think if we're thinking about both the civil society response and the government, is really thinking, how do you mainstream the quote China factor? And maybe Russia or maybe these other elements too. But for example, there's actually a very robust ecosystem of journalist unions, journalist ethics trainings, media literacy, and we're starting to see some experimentation, as we've heard from some examples, of incorporating elements about China, about how the CCP works, about how Chinese and foreign media influence works into that. But I think there's still a lot of space to improve. Rather than just thinking of solutions that tackle this, look at the strength of what actually exists, and as Dave said, has been being done for several decades now, and seeing how to incorporate elements, units, opportunities to learn and engage on some of these newer threats. So that would be my 2 cents on that question.
Thank you, Sarah. David?
Thanks, Amy. I agree with everything Sarah said. I'd say, this is such a critical question because we already have so much, to get a little bit away just from the external actors, we have so much evidence already of liberal actors and would-be autocrats using the pandemic to extend their grip on power in vulnerable democracies, including by controlling the media and the civil society space and putting out their own disinformation. And then you have an actor like China coming in to exacerbate that through training and provision of technologies of the sorts it uses at home to control information, but also by adding to that swirl of disinformation around the pandemic, in part, as Jamie Fly and others have discussed, to counteract the significantly negative hit to its reputation from this pandemic having originated in China. So, I think, just quickly, the danger, of course, is that China is going to potentially double down on dedicating even more effort to manipulating what information people consume, going further down the road of adopting more Russia, what we had traditionally thought of as Russia-style disinformation tactics, but which China seems much more comfortable using in the last 6 months. So I think, this underscores the importance of many of the methods of pushback that we've discussed, but in particular that journalists in democratic societies really have to be equipped for the digital era to be able to handle not just domestic misinformation and shore up their country's information space from foreign influence, but really training that helps local media identify the Chinese Communist Party and the Kremlin's digital vectors for influence, and equipping them with the ability, to use digital forensics, for instance, to really get at what's happening in their information space. And a lot of China's most egregious actions in Taiwan, especially, have been exposed through digital investigations, for instance, through tracing information operations back to party-linked actors. So I would just underscore the importance of that, and I'll turn it back to you.
So thank you for your answer. And now, Dominika, which is your opinion on this topic? I hope you're still with us. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think that when it comes to the pandemic disinformation right now, it's become to the point that it's really dangerous for the people to believe the conspiracies and the disinformation narratives. And I think that our role right now is to be really out there and to be very active in the information space, really engage with the public and give them an opportunity, for example, to report disinformation to us and to inform us that there is some kind of a false information out there. We need to create some, positive and competing information campaigns, and they should come from some authority, such as Red Cross, or from the governments, from the bodies and institutions that people tend to trust the most. Because, as I said at the beginning, it's right now in the point that to believe to disinformation or a conspiracy, it has become a life threat, really.
So much. So we successfully saved some minutes to offer for the ones who had the patience and the interest to follow our panel. And as far as I know, we have some questions for you. So if the organizers will help me with introducing the persons who would like to ask you some questions, please. I think it is the right moment to do it.
All right. Hello there. This is
just introduce yourself shortly and ask your question, please. Hi,
Hi, my name is Samuel Asante, representing Ghana Youth Advocacy here. And I'd like to say thank you very much to all the panelists for and also the keynote speaker for the information provided. But it seems like so far, all the various suggestions provided is based on country-based level. But don't you think that is due to this, let's say, decentralized system? That is why we are not able to counter, let's say, such disinformation from countries like China or Iran, yada, yada. But do you think that it is possible for the International Telecommunication Union under the UN to step in to create a unified system, or let's say directive, to help guide ways and means that will be able to manage information flow through social media or media network to prevent disinformation and also prevent other government from using the media as a means to promote propaganda, or let's say anything that might destroy democracy as we know it right now? This is just a question to all the panelists in there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asante. All the best to Ghana and to yourself. Do we have another intervention, another question?
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Sue. I'm the program manager at the Asia Democracy Network. And thank you so much for the fascinating presentations. And it's definitely, disinformation is definitely something that we're struggling with in the region. And my question is, in addition to the various policies put into place by the government to respond to the current challenges, safeguarding against disinformation, what are some diverse best practices of empowering people with the tools and knowledge to identify disinformation, such as media literacy programs? And do you think they are effective, and are they worth investing in?
Thank you, Sue. Just to check if there is anyone else who would like to ask you a question, maybe we'll have the time just to collect another one before going to the panelists for the answers, please.
Hi, this is Walter from Guatemala in Central America. Thank you to the Secretary General for organizing this event. Extremely relevant for the time that we are living. My question, it would be, social media companies have had difficulties to control the spread of fake news through their platforms. This has become a huge problem because now millions of citizens get informed through Facebook instead of traditional media outlets. We have seen already the harmful effect that this has for our democracy. How should governments approach this? Should social media platforms be regulated? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Walter. Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Samuel, for your questions. I hope that the answers to you will be provided within the next minutes will satisfy you. Just to wrap up, so we have a common challenge regarding the involvement at national or international level, maybe UN, as suggested Samuel, to find solutions especially in social media area and other networks providing general information. What can we do about it? And of course, the question asked by Walter regarding the regulation of media platforms. Thank you. So who would like to start with the answers?
I can start if no one else wants to. Mainly, I think to Sue's question, I think that's a great question, and it's the right one in terms of how to empower people. Because this is really where this has got to be a broad-based, bottom-up type of approach in order to build resilience. Because what China and the Kremlin and others are doing is kind of essentially trying to capture or co-opt elites, and so as that continues, no matter what happens with political processes, to the extent that you can have pressure from the bottom up, from civil society and from the media, creating transparency about this, it'll create a longer lasting and a deeper inoculation against what malign actors are doing. I think media literacy is very important. I think that those sorts of programs are really critical to educating the public, to give them the ability to discern what they're looking at. I'll say, the approach that IRI has taken is kind of combining deep research and building a really good level of empirical understanding of what's happening in each individual country around information operations and other sorts of influence, because it is so different in each place. And usually having, local researchers dig into this because they know the place best. And then sharing that information with democratic actors, partners, media, in the country so that they are better prepared to proactively expose and counter these things on their own. And it doesn't take the intervention of actors that are clearly tied to, say, the United States or outside institutions. That's going to be the most effective way to communicate this information and create the most long-lasting kind of proactive mobilization to change things at the official level. And so I just underscore that. And then, of course, as I mentioned at the outset, I think digital is so important, and making sure that the partners we have on the ground understand what to look for when they're looking for digital disinformation and how to counteract it. Leah Bray mentioned working with Taiwan partners. We've worked with GovZero, with DoubleThink, all these groups in Taiwan to share information about how China has done things in Taiwan and what has worked in terms of pushing back. So I think that's critical. And then in terms of the other questions, I'll let the other panelists cover that. But sorry, taking too much time.
Thank you, David, for answering this question. I hope that Sue followed your answer, and now we go further in the answers to another questions. Please, who would like to start?
Veronica, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to react to the question of Walter, and I just wanted to say that we can actually see some baby steps coming from the tech companies, from the social media companies, trying to deal with this huge problem. For example, we could see that Twitter already deleted some tweets that contained disinformation or false information. This was done very publicly because they actually deleted a tweet of a president of the United States, so everybody knew about it. But they're trying to deal with the problem of botnet accounts and deleting these accounts if they find them. So I think that we are like sort of on the way towards some regulations. With Facebook, it's much harder because Facebook is much more resilient to this and says that they're not going to do anything about it. We can see it before pretty much any elections, because if you pay for it, you can have any political advertisement on Facebook, and Facebook doesn't care if it's true or not. But we see some effort from the side of Facebook, at least in the Czech Republic. There is Facebook analyst who is sort of monitoring the content on Czech Facebook, and if there is a content that contains a lie or disinformation, they don't delete it. But if it comes to your feed, you don't see it immediately. You see a message that this contains disinformation. Click here if you want to know why, or click here if you want to continue to the original, content. So it's like it's nothing big, but it's something at least. And I also read, I think 2 or 3 days ago, that even YouTube is going to delete all of the content that. All of the videos that contain lies about coronavirus and the vaccination and, this microchip conspiracy and stuff. So I think we are coming by very little steps towards the regulations. And I think that the regulations for the sake of our democracies needs to be done in social media. And, some people would say that I am hypocritical, saying that in order to save democracies, we need to limit the freedom of speech. But I don't think that is the case. I think that we have a freedom of speech to, speak our opinions out loud. But honestly, denying Holocaust and saying that it never happened, it's not an opinion. It's just denying a fact. And I don't think that people should be allowed to, just write huge articles and post them on social media without any punishment or, sentence to be instated.
Thank you, Veronica. Sarah?
So I would just second Dave's comment about media literacy and some of the things that have been done in Taiwan, because I think there have been some efforts and some real successes, including, I think, with older Taiwanese in terms of expanding media literacy beyond, say, school-age children. So that's something maybe the people who are interested can look into. On the topic of regulating media, social media companies, it's quite tricky. And I think Freedom House, we generally favor the direction of requiring transparency, encouraging takedowns and identification of these particular methods, more the inauthentic behavior, as opposed to content removal, because that can become very tricky in a democratic society. But I think labeling, whether it's things like warnings to users, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube now also on the topic of, say, Chinese or other state media are very clearly labeling not only channels but individual posts as saying that this is coming from a government-funded, a state-affiliated, a state-controlled outlet. And I think that does go a long way to countering the deliberate obfuscation that like Chinese state media in particular do in how they self-identify. I just wanted to take a moment to address the question from the young man from Ghana. I'll be honest, I'm a little skeptical about the UN's ability to address this issue, including the ITU, partly because of the high degree of influence that countries like China and Russia have at the UN, and the way in which also on certain levels they're able to gather other much less democratic countries to vote with them. But I do think that your point about the multilateral element is really important. And so institutions like the Community of Democracies, conversations that are happening now at the European Union, and I think the other kind of international information sharing networks like that IRI is building, the Freedom House maybe works on sometimes among civil society are very important. So I think those kinds of conversations within the democratic societies, I think are just going to move faster and be more useful and effective for this particular problem, because it is among the countries that are concerned, have common values, and it's not going to just end up being hijacked or undercut by the very actors that we're concerned about. And so I think also for addressing the problems related to domestic political actors using disinformation as well as the foreign influence, conversations, codes of conduct, rulemaking, other information sharing within these communities of democracies seems like a more effective approach than the UN.
Thank you so much, Sarah Cook. Thank you, Veronika Kratka-Szpalkova and Dr. David Schulman. Thank you for your contribution to this panel. Thank you to the organizers for the trust that I was invested to at least to check the time. And before passing the floor to Secretary General Thomas E. Garrett, just to remember you a very interesting happening almost, I think, 60 years ago, when Vice President Nixon at the moment met the Soviet First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev in an American exhibit in Moscow, and they had a television talk. And when Mr. Khrushchev said, when you go into your country, please tell American people how well are living the Soviet people. The American one said, okay, I will do it, but please translate into Russian what I told you about the American economy, and we do the same. It's a moment in the Museum of European History in Brussels. It's a very interesting trying to dialogue between two different worlds. Thank you so much to the panelists. And now, Secretary General, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dan, for your very skilled guidance of this fascinating panel. And I want to thank all of our distinguished speakers today for their valuable interventions and their contributions to this dialogue. Also, let me take a moment just to thank the Foreign Ministry of Romania for serving as our host. And I also wish to thank the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor for their support to this program. To all of you who joined us today from many points around the world, I want to thank you for participating. And until we meet again, I want you to stay safe and to stay united. Thank you all. Goodbye.